Plato, born in 427 BC or before the Common Era, and died in 348 before the Common Era. Who is Plato, known in Arabic by the name of Plato? Plato is a classical Greek philosopher. By classical, we mean that he belongs to the era that preceded the Middle Ages. Greek refers to his nationality as he is from Greece. A philosopher means a thinker. He started his life as a poet or a dramatist, which means that in his early youth or career he wrote drama or plays, but later on he turned into philosophy. He rejected drama for some reasons and started to write philosophical works. His views about poetry or literature are not collected in one book. Instead, they are scattered in many books. The most important of these books are Ion, Phaedrus, and the Republic. Plato usually used the dialogue form in his writings, which means that he does not or he did not write his views in an essay form. He presented his views for the reader in the form of dialogue between fictional characters. The speakers of his dialogues are fictionals, which means they are not realistic characters. Usually there is one character by the name of Socrates, known in Arabic as Socrates. Here Plato is careful to have a character by the name of Socrates in his writings to represent his own views in an honor to his tutor or instructor Socrates, so that Plato is the student of Socrates. This reflects Plato's influence by his tutor or his teacher Socrates. Plato established or founded an academy for encouraging philosophical debates to offer the opportunity for people to come in this place and argue and discuss philosophical matters. Plato had two opposite views of poetry. By poetry here we mean literature. These views place poetry as inferior to all human activities. That is to say, Plato's views of poetry were negative views, not positive ones. The two views are poetry as inspiration, وحي أو إلهام and poetry as imitation تقليد أو محاكاة. Let's start by the first view. Poetry as inspiration. Plato deals with this view in two of his works, Phaedrus and Ion. Those are the names of the speakers of the dialogues or the names of characters, and at the same time the names of the books. Plato believes that the human being consists of mind and senses and emotions. He condemns poetry in general because it deals with emotions and feelings. Condemns means that he disapproves, he doesn't like poetry. Why? Because it doesn't deal with the mind and reason, it deals with feelings and emotion. He rejects the view of poetry as inspiration for the following reason. Firstly, Plato believes that the poet is not a creative or innovative person. Instead, he is a passive tool, أداة سلبية, a possessed creature, مخلوق ممسوس, without will, بدون إرادة, and without an art of his own. So that Plato sees the poet as someone almost without no skills at all. The poetry, he says, is not his own poetry. Instead, he is a tool in the hands of the muse of poetry. She comes, this muse, ربة الشعر, comes and possesses the soul of this poet and tells him poetry which is not his own, but the divine speech of the muse itself. The poet has no control on the meeting between him and the muse, as she comes and visits him whenever she wishes. So the poet is a person without any art. In his book Ion, Plato also deals with the idea of poetry as inspiration through a dialogue between Socrates, who works as a philosopher, and Ion, a rhapsode. A rhapsode means a singer, the one who takes the lines of verses and sings them in front of the audience. Socrates tells Ion that the poet has no invention or no creation إبداع of his own خاص بيه, because he cannot say poetry until he is inspired and becomes out of his senses. So that Socrates tells Ion, the gift which you possess, الموهبة اللي انت بتملكها, is not an art, ليست فن, but an inspiration, وحي. What do we mean by this? It's something external. It comes to you from outside you, not inside you. Thus, the poet is only a passive tool, passive, not active. The poet doesn't perform something active to produce his poetry. The poet is waiting passively for the coming of the muse or the goddess of poetry to give him her divine words. During the process of inspiration, the poet cannot control his own mind. In Ion also, Plato gives another reason for rejecting the idea of poetry as inspiration. The second reason is that the poet lacks true knowledge of the divine truth. He says, what do we mean by the divine truth? The lines of verses said by the muse, because she is a goddess. So her words are divine truth. Unfortunately, the poet does not realize or does not recognize the value of this truth. During inspiration, God or the muse takes away the minds of poets and uses them as his ministers, which means his agents. So, what the poet says is the words of God or the divine truth. By God here we mean the muse of poetry, ربة الشعر, that the poet cannot evaluate or recognize the value because he is in a state of frenzy. الشاعر بيكون في حالة من المس أو التأثر، فمش مركز، مش هيعرف يفهم قيمة الشعر اللي بتقوله له ربة الشعر. The third reason in Ion is that both the poet and the rhapsode or the singer ignore the reality of the subject matter or the topic or the content of the poetry they utter. They say, because the rhapsode is inspired by the poet who is in a state of frenzy. Because the poet is in a state of frenzy or in a state of poetic ecstasy or lack of concentration because of his influence by the poetry he is listening to from the muse, so that the poet is ignorant. He lacks knowledge of what he is listening to, so that when the poet tells the rhapsode or the singer these lines of verses, he transfers his ignorance to him and equally transfers his state of frenzy. Fourth, the poet is a madman and makes the audience mad like him. When the poet is inspired by the muse and the rhapsode who is inspired by the poet say their poetry in a state of frenzy or a state of poetic ecstasy in front of the audience are inspired or influenced or affected by them and become in a state of frenzy too. Plato called this magnetic chain. Plato شبه التأثير بتاع ربة الشعر على الشاعر، إنها بتقول قدامه شعر وبتأثر عليه، إنها زي المغناطيس بيجذبه. هو لما بيقول الشعر للمغني بيجذبه هو كمان، المغني يقول الشعر للجمهور يجذبهم، فكأننا عندنا مغناطيس بيجذب قطع حديد. He compares the effect of the poet on the audience to the effect of magnet on nails. nails اللي هي المسامير. The muses first of all inspire men themselves. يبقى the first process is the muse اللي هي the goddess of poetry. Inspires يعني selects some men اللي هم the poets to tell them her poetry, and from these men or these poets, those inspired persons, a chain of other persons, there is a group of other persons is suspended, which means is waiting, who take the inspiration. When the poet is under the effect of the muse, he goes through changeable emotions, which means that when the poet is listening to poetry, he feels different emotions. He affects the rhapsode who transfers this effect to the audience. If the poem is sad, the poet feels sadness and he might cry. If the poem is exciting, the poet feels enthusiastic, and so on. So Plato condemns the idea of poetry as inspiration in both his two books, Phaedrus and Ion. He believes that the poet has no control on his own mind and is a passive tool in the hands of the muse. He has no invention of his own. Both the poet and the rhapsode ignore the importance and reality of poetry, and they transfer their state of frenzy to the audience that may have bad effect on them. That's why Plato banished or dismissed يعني نفى طرد the poets out of his republic. This is the end of our lecture. Thanks for watching and goodbye.